Within the crumbling walls of his family's forgotten estate, Kael stumbled upon something that would change his life forever. Hidden beneath layers of dust and time, an ancient map whispered secrets of a realm most believed to be mere legend, the Mystic Lands. This wasn't just a map, it was a key to a destiny he never asked for, tied to a prophecy as old as magic itself. What started as a quest to uncover his lineage quickly spiraled into something far greater, a journey where every step could mean the difference between salvation and the unraveling of magic as the world knows it. But Kael wasn't just chasing answers, he was running from a truth that could either save him or destroy everything he holds dear. Where are you joining us from, and what time is it there? Because where Kael is headed, time itself bends to the will of the Arcane, and the stakes are higher than anyone could imagine, ready to uncover the secrets of the Mystic Lands. Let's begin. The sun hung low over the horizon as Kael stepped onto the cobblestone streets of Eldermere, the air thick with the salty tang of the sea and the clamor of merchants hawking their wares. The port city was alive with activity. Ships creaked in the harbor, their sails billowing in the breeze, while sailors and traders bustled about, their voices mingling in a cacophony of languages. Kael's eyes scanned the crowded docks, searching for a captain willing to take him to the Shrouded Isles, the first stop on his journey to unlock the secrets of the ancient map. But finding passage was proving harder than he'd anticipated. Most sailors dismissed the Shrouded Isles as a place of myth, a cursed land shrouded in mist and mystery. It was then that Kael noticed a figure weaving through the crowd with the ease of someone who knew every shadow and alleyway. She was slight but quick, her movements sharp and deliberate, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with a calculating gaze. When she approached him, her voice carried a hint of mischief. Looking for a guide, she asked, a sly smile playing on her lips. Her name was Lyra, a self-proclaimed rogue with a reputation for slipping in and out of trouble. She claimed to know the waters well, even the treacherous route to the Shrouded Isles, but her offer came with a price, a share of whatever treasure Kael sought. Kael hesitated, trusting a stranger, especially one who seemed so skilled in deception, felt like a risk. Yet time was running short, and every moment spent in Eldermere brought him closer to failure. With little choice, he agreed, though the uneasy tension between them was palpable. Lyra's motives were unclear, and Kael couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Their uneasy alliance was put to the test almost immediately. As they made their way to the docks under the cover of night, shadowy figures emerged from the alleys, their movements swift and silent. Kael barely had time to draw his blade before the first attacker lunged at him. The ambush was well coordinated, the work of a rival mage who had been tracking Kael since he left the academy. Lyra fought with surprising skill, her daggers flashing in the moonlight, but the encounter left Kael questioning her true intentions. Was she truly on his side, or had she led him into a trap? As the dust settled, Kael faced a difficult decision. Trusting Lyra could mean gaining a valuable ally, but it could also mean walking into another ambush. Striking out on his own would leave him without a guide, but it might also keep him one step ahead of his enemies. The weight of his choice pressed heavily on him, knowing that his decision could either bring him closer to his goal or doom his quest before it truly began. The creak of the ship's timbers echoed beneath their feet as Kael and Lira stumbled aboard, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding from the chaos of the ambush. The crew moved swiftly, unfurling sails and shouting orders, while the two travelers retreated to the ship's bow, the salty spray of the sea stinging their faces. For a moment, the adrenaline ebbed, and the vast expanse of the ocean stretched before them, an endless horizon promising both refuge and uncertainty. But their respite was short-lived. Kael's fingers brushed against the worn parchment in his satchel, and he couldn't resist. He unrolled the map, his eyes tracing the intricate lines and symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light. What had once appeared as mere markings now revealed a deeper mystery. Strange glyphs, almost imperceptible, curled along the edges of the map, whispering secrets of an ancient ritual. His pulse quickened. Could this be the key to the power they sought, or was it something far more dangerous? Lyra, standing a few paces away, watched him with narrowed eyes. She had always been the more cautious of the two, her instincts honed by years of survival in a world where trust was a luxury. The way Kael hunched over the map, his focus so intense, set off alarms in her mind. She stepped closer, her voice low but sharp. "What are you hiding, Kael?" He flinched, caught off guard, and quickly rolled the map back up. "Nothing," he said, too quickly. "Just trying to make sense of where we're heading." Her gaze hardened. "We've been through too much for you to start keeping secrets now. If there's something I need to know, you'd better tell me." The tension between them crackled like static in the air. Kael hesitated, torn between his growing suspicions about the map's true purpose and the trust he and Lyra had built over countless trials. But before he could respond, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Both turned to see dark clouds gathering on the horizon, churning like a tempest born of anger. The storm was coming, and with it, a decision that could change everything. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Kael's mind raced. Should he share what he discovered, risking Lyra's wrath and potentially revealing a truth neither of them was ready to face? Or should he keep it to himself, preserving their fragile alliance, but sowing seeds of doubt that might grow into something far more destructive? The weight of the choice pressed heavily on him, as heavy as the storm clouds now bearing down on their fragile vessel. The ship groaned against the rising waves, and the crew scrambled to secure the sails. Lyra crossed her arms, her expression unreadable, but her eyes never left Kael. The storm wasn't just brewing in the sky, it was brewing between them. And as the wind howled and the waves crashed against the hull, Kael knew that whatever he decided next would shape not only their journey, but the fate of the Shrouded Isles itself. The storm raged with a fury that seemed almost alive, its howling winds and towering waves battering the ship from every side. The crew scrambled, their shouts barely audible over the deafening roar of the tempest. Kael, clutching the railing, felt the raw power of the storm coursing through him, a chaotic energy that matched the turmoil in his heart. Drawing on his fledgling magical abilities, he focused his will, channeling the arcane forces within him to calm the churning waters. Slowly, the waves began to still, the wind easing into a gentle breeze, but the effort left him drained, his legs buckling beneath him as he collapsed to the deck. Lyra, who had been watching from a distance, approached with a mixture of awe and curiosity. She had always seen Kael as little more than a novice, someone to be tolerated rather than respected. But now her perspective shifted. The sheer magnitude of what he had accomplished, taming a storm with nothing but his will, was no small feat. For the first time, she regarded him not as a burden, but as a potential ally. "You've got more in you than I thought," she said, her voice carrying a rare note of approval. Yet their moment of relief was fleeting. The strange calm that followed the storm seemed almost unnatural, a silence so profound it was unsettling. Then, without warning, the sea erupted. A massive serpent, its scales glistening like molten silver, surged from the depths. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, drawn to the arcane energy Kael had unleashed. The creature coiled around the ship, its massive body threatening to crush the hull. Panic spread among the crew as they scrambled to defend themselves, but their weapons seemed useless against the beast's impenetrable hide. Kael, still weakened from his earlier efforts, knew he couldn't face this threat alone. Lyra, ever resourceful, moved to his side, her daggers gleaming in the dim light. "We'll take it down together," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. With Kael focusing his magic to disrupt the serpent's movements, and Lyra striking with precision, they began to turn the tide. It was a precarious dance, each relying on the other's strengths to compensate for their own weaknesses. Slowly, they wore the creature down, their combined efforts forcing it to retreat into the depths. As the serpent vanished beneath the waves, the crew erupted into cheers, their fear replaced by a newfound sense of camaraderie. Kael and Lyra exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of what they had just achieved. Though their bond was still fragile, forged under the pressure of survival, it was a start. In the face of overwhelming odds, they had found something unexpected: trust. And in the forgotten realms, where danger lurked around every corner, that trust might just be the key to their survival. The Shrouded Isles loomed before Kael and Lyra like a forgotten dream, cloaked in mist and mystery. As their boat scraped against the jagged shore, the air grew heavy with the weight of ancient magic. Towering above them stood a labyrinthine temple, its walls etched with runes that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The structure seemed to breathe, its every stone whispering secrets of the past. But this was no sanctuary. It was a fortress, guarded by wards older than memory, designed to keep the unworthy at bay. The first challenge came swiftly. The wards demanded more than mere strength or skill. They required a purity of intent. Kael, ever the seeker of truth, stepped forward first, his heart pounding as the runes flared to life. The temple seemed to peer into his soul, testing his resolve. A vision materialized before him, an echo of his deepest fears, a shadow of failure and loss that had haunted him since childhood. For a moment he faltered, his breath catching in his throat, but then he remembered Lyra, standing steadfast beside him, and the prophecy that bound them both. With a steadying breath, he pushed through, the wards dissolving as if acknowledging his courage. Lyra, however, faced a trial of a different kind. The temple's magic delved into her past, unearthing memories she had long buried. Flashes of her life as a thief, the nights spent in shadow, the deals struck in desperation, played out before her. The temple's voice echoed in her mind, accusing and unyielding. You are defined by your choices, it seemed to say. Lyra clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. She had spent years running from who she was, but now, standing in the heart of this ancient place, she realized she could no longer hide. I am more than my past, she whispered, her voice steady, and with that declaration, the temple's judgment passed, the path ahead clearing. Together, they pressed deeper into the labyrinth, their bond growing stronger with each step. The air grew colder, the walls closer, until they reached a chamber bathed in an eerie, golden light. At its center rested a relic, a crystalline shard that seemed to hum with a power both alluring and dangerous. Kael recognized it instantly. This was the key to his prophecy, the object that could change everything. But as he reached for it, a voice, ancient and resonant, filled the chamber. Beware, it warned. This power comes at a cost. To wield it is to risk unleashing a great evil one that could consume all. Kael hesitated, his hand hovering above the relic. Lyra's eyes met his, and in that moment, they both understood the gravity of the choice before them. It wasn't just about fulfilling a prophecy or claiming power. It was about trust, about the weight of their partnership. Could they risk everything for the chance to alter fate? Or would they walk away, leaving the relic untouched, but their purpose unfulfilled? The air between them crackled with tension, their unspoken fears and hopes hanging in the balance. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, waiting for their decision, and as Kael's fingers closed around the shard, a tremor ran through the temple, a reminder that nothing in the Shrouded Isles came without consequence. The air grew tense as Kael and Lyra stood before the ancient relic, its surface shimmering faintly in the dim light of the chamber. Kael's voice was firm, his eyes locked on the artifact. "This is what we came for," he said, his tone unwavering. "The relic holds the key to everything. Our quest, the answers we've been searching for. We can't leave it behind." He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the relic's surface, as if drawn by an invisible force. But Lyra stepped forward, her expression etched with concern. "This isn't just some trinket, Kael. Its power raw and untamed. We don't even know what it's capable of. Taking it could unleash something we can't control." Her voice softened, but her urgency was unmistakable. "We need to think this through. Rushing in could cost us everything." Kael turned to her, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Think this through, Lyra. We've been chasing shadows for months. This is our chance to finally make a difference. If we walk away now, we might as well give up." His words were sharp, his patience wearing thin. Lyra's eyes flashed with equal intensity. "And if we take it without understanding what we're dealing with, we could end up worse than where we started." "This isn't just about us. It's about what happens if we're wrong." The tension between them crackled like a storm about to break, their voices rising as their argument spiraled. Just as their tempers threatened to boil over, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the chamber. Kael and Lyra froze, their eyes darting to the entrance. The rival mage stepped into view, flanked by a group of mercenaries, their weapons gleaming in the faint light. "Ah, what do we have here?" the mage sneered. "A pair of thieves, it seems. How fortunate for me." Before either of them could react, the mercenaries surged forward, blades drawn. Kael and Lyra exchanged a glance. their argument momentarily forgotten. They moved as one, their years of partnership kicking in despite the tension. Lyra summoned a barrier of light, deflecting a barrage of arrows, while Kael unleashed a torrent of fire, forcing their attackers to scatter. The chamber erupted into chaos, the clash of steel and bursts of magic filling the air. Amid the fray, Kael's gaze fell back on the relic. The decision weighed heavily on him, but the urgency of the moment left no room for hesitation. As Lyra fended off another wave of mercenaries, Kael reached out and grasped the relic. The moment his fingers closed around it, a surge of energy coursed through him, as if the artifact had been waiting for his touch all along. He barely had time to register the sensation before Lyra's voice cut through the din. "Kael, what are you doing?" He turned to her, the relic in hand, his expression resolute. "We don't have a choice. If they get it, it's over." Lyra's eyes widened, but before she could protest, the rival mage's laughter rang out. "Oh, this is priceless," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You've just sealed your fate." With the relic now in their possession, Kael and Lyra fought their way through the mercenaries, their movements growing more desperate as the enemy closed in. The relic pulsed in Kael's hand, its energy growing stronger with each passing moment. As they finally broke free of the chamber and into the open air, the weight of what they'd done began to settle. Kael could feel the relic's power humming beneath his skin, a constant reminder of the choice he'd made. Lyra shot him a look, her anger tempered by fear. "You have no idea what you've just done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael met her gaze, his own doubts creeping in, but there was no turning back now. The relic was theirs, and with it, a path that would change everything, for better or worse. As the winds howled across the Shrouded Isles, Kael and Lyra found themselves racing against time, their breaths ragged as the rival mage's forces closed in. The air was thick with tension, the scent of salt and storm clinging to their cloaks as they fled toward the rocky cliffs. Kael clutched the relic tightly, its surface warm against his palm, almost as if it pulsed with a life of its own. But this was no comfort, not when his mind began to betray him. Strange visions flickered at the edges of his thoughts, flashes of a future both grand and foreboding. He saw himself standing atop a crumbling tower, the skies above roiling with power, but beneath his feet, shadows writhed like serpents. Was this a glimpse of destiny, or a warning? Lyra, ever watchful, noticed the change in him. Her sharp eyes caught the way he hesitated mid-step, the way his gaze would drift, as if seeing something far beyond the present. "Kael," she said, her voice steady but edged with concern. "This relic, it's changing you, can't you feel it?" He brushed her off with a curt laugh, his focus locked on the artifact. "It's showing me things, Lyra, things we need to know. I can't stop now." Her unease grew, but she said nothing more, her silence a quiet storm of its own. Their path led them away from the jagged cliffs and into the vast expanse of the whispering desert. The sand stretched endlessly, a sea of gold under the blistering sun. But this was no ordinary desert. Legends spoke of its shifting dunes, of ruins buried beneath the sands that whispered secrets to those who dared listen. The air itself seemed alive, carrying faint murmurs that danced just out of reach. Kael pressed forward, driven by the visions that now haunted his every waking moment. Lyra followed, her steps deliberate, her hand never far from the hilt of her blade. She didn't trust the desert, and she didn't trust the relic, but for now, she had no choice but to stay by Kael's side. As they ventured deeper, the ruins began to emerge, ancient stone pillars, jutting from the sand like broken teeth. Strange symbols etched into their surfaces glimmered faintly in the sunlight, their meaning lost to time. Kael traced a finger along one, his brow furrowed. The relic in his hand hummed, as if responding to the carvings. Lyra watched him closely, her unease deepening. "This place feels wrong," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper, but Kael barely heard her. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the labyrinth of visions the relic had shown him. He could feel it pulling him, guiding him towards something, or someone, and though he couldn't see it yet, the shadows at the edge of his visions grew darker with every step. The desert was a place of secrets, and Kael was determined to uncover them, but as the sands shifted beneath their feet and the whispers grew louder, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, one set not by the rival mage, but by the very relic Kael refused to let go. The whispering desert stretched endlessly before Kael and Lyra, its golden dunes shimmering under the relentless sun. As they trudged forward, the faint sound of voices carried on the wind, growing louder with each step. Soon, they found themselves surrounded by a nomadic tribe, their faces weathered by time and the elements. The tribe moved with a quiet grace, their eyes drawn to the relic Kael carried, as if it were a beacon calling to them. At the center of the group stood Nara, the tribe's seer, her piercing gaze cutting through the haze of the desert heat. Nara stepped forward, her voice low and steady as she spoke. "You carry a great burden, traveler," she said, her eyes fixed on the relic. "This artifact is not merely a tool or a weapon. It is a living echo of the past, a fragment of power that has shaped the destiny of many. But beware, its light casts a shadow, and that shadow can consume even the strongest of hearts." Her words hung in the air, heavy with warning. Kael, torn between curiosity and caution, listened intently. Nara offered him a path to understanding, a chance to unravel the relic's secrets, but her offer came with a condition. He would have to undergo a ritual, one that would force him to face his deepest fears and darkest regrets. "The desert whispers truths that the mind buries," Nara explained. "To know the relic's purpose, you must first know yourself." Lyra, ever the skeptic, stepped forward, her voice sharp with distrust. "And what guarantees do we have that this ritual isn't some trick, that you're not leading him into a trap?" Her hand rested on the hilt of her blade, a silent reminder of the dangers they'd faced before. But Nara's expression remained calm, almost serene. "The desert does not lie," she replied. "Its trials are harsh, but they reveal what is real. The choice is his alone." Kael hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing on him. The relic had already changed his life in ways he couldn't fully grasp, and the thought of turning back now felt impossible. With a deep breath, he nodded. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty churning within him. Lyra's eyes widened, a flicker of concern crossing her face, but she said nothing. She knew Kael well enough to understand that once his mind was set, there was no dissuading him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in hues of orange and purple, the tribe began to prepare for the ritual. Kael stood at the edge of the circle, his heart pounding in anticipation. The air seemed to hum with energy, the relic glowing faintly in his hands. Nara approached, her presence both comforting and unnerving. To face the relic's truth, she said, you must first face your own. The desert will guide you, but the journey is yours to make. The ritual began, the world around Kael shifting as the lines between reality and memory blurred. He felt himself pulled into a whirlwind of emotions, each one more vivid and raw than the last. The desert's whispers grew louder, echoing the fears and doubts he had buried deep within. It was a test unlike any he had faced before, one that would demand everything he had to give. And as the night deepened, Kael stepped into the unknown, ready to confront whatever lay ahead. As the ritual's energy envelops him, Kael feels the world around him dissolve into a swirling mist of light and shadow. In an instant, he's thrust into a vision so vivid, it feels as real as the ground beneath his feet. He sees himself standing atop a towering citadel, bathed in the golden glow of a setting sun. Armies cheer his name, their voices a thunderous roar as he holds the relic aloft, its power radiating like a beacon of hope. But then the scene shifts, the sky darkens, and the same relic now pulses with a menacing, crimson glow. The citadel crumbles, and the armies that once hailed him now flee in terror. Kael watches helplessly as destruction spreads like wildfire, and he realizes with a chilling certainty he is the cause of it all. The vision ends as abruptly as it began, leaving Kael gasping for breath, his heart pounding like a drum. His hands tremble as he looks down at the relic, its once mysterious glow now a haunting reminder of what could be. Nara steps forward, her expression a mix of solemnity and urgency. She explains that the mystic lands are more than just a source of power. They are a prison. An ancient evil, sealed away eons ago, lies dormant there, bound by the very relic Kael now holds. Its power was never meant to be wielded, but to contain. And now, with the relic in his hands, Kael has unwittingly become the key to either keeping that evil locked away or setting it free. The weight of this revelation crashes over him like a tidal wave. He had thought his journey was about unlocking power, about becoming something greater than he was. But now, faced with the reality of what's at stake, Kael feels the enormity of his choices pressing down on him. Nara's voice is steady, but filled with warning, as she tells him that the path ahead is fraught with danger, far beyond what either of them could have anticipated. The relic's power is a double-edged sword, and every step forward risks tipping the balance between salvation and ruin. Kael stares into the distance, his mind racing. The vision of his possible future lingers in his thoughts, a stark reminder of the stakes. He wonders if he has the strength to carry this burden, to make the choices that could shape the fate of countless lives. The mystic lands, once a distant dream, now feel like a looming shadow, their allure tempered by the terrifying truth of what lies within. As the gravity of his quest settles over him, Kael realizes that he stands at a crossroads. To continue is to risk unleashing something unimaginable. To turn back is to abandon the power that could change everything for better or for worse. The question hangs in the air, heavy and unspoken. What path will he choose? Kael stood at the edge of the vast desert, the weight of his past pressing down on him like the unrelenting sun. He clenched his fists, the resolve in his heart burning brighter than ever. This journey wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming something far greater. His family's legacy, tarnished by years of secrets and betrayal, needed to be set right. He couldn't turn back now, not when so much was at stake. Beside him, Lyra shifted uneasily, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had agreed to stay, but the tension between them was palpable, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Their partnership, once built on trust, now felt fragile, like a thread stretched too thin. As they moved forward, the desert gave way to rocky terrain, the landscape shifting as if mirroring the turmoil within them. It was there, amidst the jagged cliffs and narrow passes, that the ambush came. Shadowy figures emerged from the rocks, their movements precise, their intentions clear. Kael and Lira fought back, their magic flaring in bursts of light and energy. But this time, something was different. The rival mage stepped forward, his presence commanding, his face eerily familiar. When he removed his hood, the truth hit Kael like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just an enemy, this was his uncle, a man he had believed long gone, a man who had vanished from his family's stories without explanation. The revelation left Kael reeling. His uncle's voice, cold and calculating, cut through the chaos. He spoke of the Relic's power, of his own plans to claim it, and of the family's hidden history, a history Kael had never known. The ground beneath Kael seemed to shift, not just physically, but emotionally. Everything he thought he understood about his family, about his purpose, was now in question. Could he trust his own memories? Could he trust the path he had chosen? Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and urgent, pulling him back to the present. But even as they fought side by side, the rift between them widened, each of them grappling with doubts that words couldn't resolve. The encounter left them battered but alive, the weight of the confrontation lingering in the air. Kael's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his uncle's words. What else had been hidden from him? What other truths lay buried in the shadows of his family's past? As they pressed onward, the relic no longer felt like just a goal. It felt like a key, a way to unlock the secrets that had shaped his life. But with every step, the questions grew louder, and the path ahead seemed more uncertain than ever. Kael and Lyra barely managed to escape the ambush, the echoes of betrayal still ringing in Kael's ears. As they put distance between themselves and their attackers, Kael's mind raced with a storm of emotions, anger, confusion, and a deep sense of loss. The people he once trusted had turned against him, and the weight of that realization pressed heavily on his chest. Lyra, ever perceptive, noticed his turmoil. She walked beside him in silence for a while, letting him process, before finally speaking. "We can't let this derail us," she said, her voice steady but gentle. "The mission is bigger than any one betrayal. The mystic lands are still out there, and we're the only ones who can stop what's coming." With her words, Kael felt a flicker of clarity. He nodded, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. Together, they pressed on, their path now leading them toward the Obsidian Peaks, a jagged, volcanic mountain range that loomed ominously on the horizon. Legends spoke of the peaks as a place of immense power, where the very earth seemed alive with energy. It was said that somewhere within those treacherous slopes, lay the key to unlocking the mystic lands. The journey was fraught with danger, but Kael and Lira had no choice. The stakes were too high to turn back now. As they traveled, Kael began to feel a strange connection to the relic he carried. The artifact, once an enigma, now pulsed with a life of its own, its power intertwining with his own energy. He could sense its potential growing with each passing day, and he started to experiment with its abilities, channeling its magic in ways he hadn't dared before. The results were astonishing. He could summon bursts of energy, conjure shields of light, and even manipulate the elements around him. But with each use, the relic's presence in his mind grew stronger, its whispers more insistent. It was as if the artifact was alive, feeding on his determination and ambition. Lyra watched him closely, her concern deepening with every demonstration of the relic's power. Kael, she warned one evening as they camped beneath the shadow of the peaks. You need to be careful. This thing, it's not just a tool, it's changing you. Can't you feel it? Kael brushed off her concerns, his confidence fueled by the relic's growing influence. I'm fine, he insisted. I've got this under control. We need every advantage we can get if we're going to make it through the Obsidian Peaks. But Lyra wasn't convinced. She could see the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the way his eyes flickered with an unfamiliar intensity, the way his decisions became more impulsive. The closer they got to the peaks, the more the relic seemed to take hold of Kael's thoughts. Its whispers became a constant hum in the back of his mind, urging him to push further, to embrace its power fully. Lyra's warnings grew more urgent, but Kael's determination blinded him to the danger. He was so focused on mastering the relic and reaching the mystic lands that he failed to notice the toll it was taking on him. And as the Obsidian Peaks rose before them, dark and foreboding, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that the relic was no longer just a tool. It was becoming a part of him, for better or worse. As the journey led Kael and Lyra deeper into the Obsidian Peaks, the air grew thin, and the jagged shadows of the towering mountains seemed to close in around them. The path ahead was not just a test of their stamina, but a gauntlet of challenges designed to push them to their limits. Each step forward brought a new obstacle: treacherous cliffs, freezing winds, and riddles carved into the stone by those who had come before. These trials weren't just physical, they demanded sharp minds and unshakable resolve. Kael, driven by his determination to master the relic's power, pressed on, while Lyra's cautious nature kept her watchful, her instincts warning her of the dangers ahead. At the heart of the peaks, they encountered the ancient guardian sentinel figures carved from black stone, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. These beings spoke in voices that echoed like thunder, challenging Kael's worthiness to wield the relic. Prove your heart, they demanded, or fall to the darkness that awaits the unworthy. Kael stood firm, his confidence unwavering, but the trials that followed were more grueling than either of them had anticipated. He faced illusions of his deepest fears, battles against his own doubts, and moments where the weight of his choices threatened to crush him. Yet, through sheer willpower, he emerged victorious, the relic's power surging through him like a storm. But victory came at a price. As Kael's connection to the relic deepened, so did its influence. Dark visions began to plague him, showing glimpses of destruction and chaos, fueled by his own hand. His decisions grew impulsive, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. Lyra noticed the change immediately. The once steady and thoughtful Kael now seemed unpredictable, even reckless. She confronted him one evening as they camped beneath the cold, starless sky. "This relic is changing you," she said, her voice firm but laced with concern. "It's not a tool, it's a curse. You need to let it go before it consumes you." Kael, however, refused to listen. "I can control it," he insisted, his eyes flashing with a defiance that bordered on desperation. "I've come too far to turn back now. This power, it's the only way we can stop what's coming." His words were resolute, but the cracks in his resolve were becoming harder to ignore. Even as he spoke, the relic pulsed faintly in his hand, its dark energy whispering promises of strength and dominance. Lyra, though torn between loyalty and fear, knew the path he was choosing could lead to ruin. But with Kael unwilling to yield, the two found themselves at a crossroads, their partnership strained by the very power they had sought to harness. The Obsidian Peaks had tested their endurance, but the true trial, the battle for Kael's soul, was only just beginning. The air grew colder as Kael and Lyra finally stood before the heart of the Obsidian Peaks, the jagged cliffs towering like ancient sentinels around them. At the center of this desolate expanse pulsed a massive obsidian archway, its surface shimmering with faint, otherworldly light. This was it, the portal to the mystic lands, the culmination of their perilous journey. But as they stepped closer, the archway's surface rippled, and a voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the air. "To pass, a sacrifice must be made," it intoned. Kael froze, his heart sinking as the words settled over him. A sacrifice. He exchanged a glance with Lyra, her expression mirroring his unease. The voice continued, laying out the terms. Kael would have to give up a part of himself, his memories, his magic, or his bond with Lyra. Each option carried its own weight, its own cost, but none of them were choices he could make lightly. Kael's mind raced, his memories, years of experiences, lessons, and moments that shaped who he was, were a core part of his identity. Losing them would mean losing pieces of himself, pieces he wasn't sure he could live without. His magic, on the other hand, was his strength, his tool, the very thing that had carried him this far. To weaken himself now, in the face of unknown dangers ahead, felt like a risk he couldn't afford. And then there was Lyra. The bond they shared had grown stronger with every step of their journey, a connection that had become a source of comfort and strength for them both. To sever that bond felt unthinkable, but the portal demanded a price, and time was running out. Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Let me do it," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I'll make the sacrifice. You've already given so much." But Kael shook his head, his resolve hardening. "No," he replied firmly. "This is my burden to carry, not yours. I won't let you give up anything for me." The weight of his decision pressed down on him, but there was no hesitation in his voice. He couldn't let Lyra bear this cost, not when she had already risked so much to stand by his side. Instead, he turned back to the portal, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out. "I choose my magic," he declared, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. In that moment, a searing pain shot through him, as though a part of his very essence was being torn away. The world blurred, and when the pain finally subsided, he felt weaker. His connection to the arcane energies he once wielded, now fractured and diminished. But as he looked at Lyra, he knew he had made the right choice. Their bond remained unbroken, a silent promise between them that no sacrifice could sever. The portal flared to life, its surface rippling like liquid shadow, ready to carry them forward. Together, they stepped through, leaving the Obsidian Peaks behind and stepping into the unknown. Kael's magic might have been weakened, but his resolve had never been stronger. The mystic lands awaited, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the shimmering portal stabilized, Kael and Lira stepped through, their senses instantly overwhelmed by the mystic lands. The air thrummed with an otherworldly energy, a strange blend of beauty and foreboding. Towering crystalline trees glistened under a sky, painted in hues of violet and gold, while the ground beneath their feet pulsed faintly, as if alive. It was a realm where nature itself seemed to breathe, but beneath its breathtaking surface lurked a darkness that sent chills down their spines. No sooner had they taken their first steps than the ancient evil made its presence known. A low, guttural growl echoed through the air, and the ground trembled as a monstrous shadow began to coalesce before them. This was no mere creature. It was the very force the relic had been created to contain. Its form shifted and writhed, a chaotic mass of tendrils and glowing eyes, radiating malice and hunger. Kael gripped the relic tightly, feeling its power surge in response to the evil's presence. It was then that he understood the true nature of the artifact. The relic wasn't just a key to the mystic lands. It was a weapon, one capable of destroying the evil, but at a terrible cost. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt. To use it would risk unleashing its full power, potentially causing devastation far beyond the mystic lands. But to hesitate could mean allowing the ancient evil to break free and consume the world. Lyra, ever the voice of reason, stepped closer to Kael, her eyes filled with urgency. "We need to think this through," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that flickered in her gaze. "If we act rashly, we could make everything worse. There has to be another way." But Kael's resolve wavered as the evil's influence began to seep into his mind. Whispers, faint at first but growing louder, echoed in his thoughts, tempting him with promises of power and control. "You could end this," the voice hissed. "No one else has the strength. No one else can do what must be done." His grip on the relic tightened as he struggled to push back against the manipulation. Lyra's words clashed with the whispers, creating a storm of doubt and determination within him. The weight of the decision bore down on him, heavier than any burden he had ever carried. Should he risk everything to destroy the evil, or would the cost be too great? The mystic lands seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting his choice. The surreal beauty of the realm stood in stark contrast to the darkness that threatened to consume it, a reminder of what was at stake. Kael's heart raced, his every instinct torn between caution and action. The relic pulsed in his hand, its power both a promise and a warning. And in that moment, Kael knew that whatever he decided, the consequences would echo far beyond the borders of this strange, perilous land. The fate of the world rested on a knife's edge, and the clock was ticking. As Kael and Lyra ventured deeper into the mystic lands, the air grew heavier, thick with the weight of unseen forces. The trials they faced were not just physical obstacles, but mirrors reflecting their innermost fears and desires. For Kael, the relic he carried became more than a tool. It was a whisper, a pull, a seductive promise of power that seemed to grow louder with every step. Its energy intertwined with his own, and the line between his will and its influence began to blur. What started as a quest to protect the realms now felt like a battle to protect himself from the very thing he sought to control. Lyra watched in quiet desperation as her friend changed, his once clear purpose clouded by the relic's allure. She knew the stakes were higher than ever, not just for the world they were trying to save, but for the man she had sworn to stand beside. The closer Kael came to the relic's full potential, the further he drifted from the person he used to be. And so, with a resolve born of both fear and love, Lyra made a choice. One night, as Kael slept fitfully under the relic's shadow, she took it into her hands. Her heart pounded as she weighed the cost. Destroying the relic could mean losing Kael forever, but leaving it intact could mean losing him to something far worse. The moment she struck the relic, a surge of energy erupted, shaking the ground beneath her feet. Kael awoke to the chaos, his eyes locking onto Lyra as she stood defiantly against the storm of power she had unleashed. In that instant, he realized the depth of her sacrifice. The relic, now crackling with unstable energy, demanded his attention, urging him to reclaim it. But Lyra's gaze held him steady, a silent plea cutting through the noise. For the first time in weeks, clarity pierced through the fog of his ambition. He was faced with a choice that would define not just his fate, but who he truly was, the promise of ultimate power, or the woman who had risked everything to bring him back. The tension in the air was palpable as Kael hesitated, torn between the two forces pulling at him. The relic's voice was intoxicating, promising dominion over all he desired. But Lyra's sacrifice was a reminder of something deeper, a bond forged in trust, in shared struggles, in the quiet moments of humanity that no relic could replicate. The moment stretched, the weight of his decision pressing down as the mystic lands seemed to hold their breath. Would he succumb to the relic's call, or would he choose the path that Lyra had fought so hard to show him? Kael stood at the edge of the crumbling temple, the relic pulsing ominously in his hand. Its dark energy coursed through him, whispering promises of untold power, but also destruction. Lyra lay unconscious before him, her breathing shallow, her life slipping away. The choice was clear, though it tore at him. He could keep the relic, harness its power, and perhaps save himself. Or he could use what little magic he had left to save her. Without hesitation, Kael turned away from the relic, his hands glowing faintly as he poured his remaining strength into healing Lyra. The relic's hold on him shattered like glass, its dark whispers silenced as his magic surged into her. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, but Kael's own strength was spent. He collapsed to his knees, his body trembling from the effort. The temple around them began to crumble as the relic's power destabilized, unleashing the ancient evil it had contained. Shadows twisted and writhed, forming into a monstrous shape that loomed over them. Kael and Lyra exchanged a glance, their bond stronger than ever. Together they stood, battered but unbroken. Lyra's quick thinking and Kael's ingenuity became their greatest weapons. They wove spells in tandem, not with brute force, but with cleverness, exploiting the creature's weaknesses. The battle was fierce, their spells clashing against the dark entity in a dazzling display of light and shadow. Just as they began to gain the upper hand, a familiar voice echoed through the ruins. "You always were too soft, Kael," his uncle sneered, stepping into the fray. The rival mage had arrived, drawn by the Relic's power and eager to claim it for himself. His eyes gleamed with greed as he surveyed the scene. Kael's heart sank. His uncle had always been a formidable opponent, and now, weakened and exhausted, Kael would have to face him in a final, desperate struggle. But this wasn't just about power or revenge. It was about protecting the world from the darkness his uncle sought to unleash. With Lyra by his side, Kael steeled himself for the fight of his life, knowing that even in his weakened state, he had something his uncle could never understand: the strength of a true bond. The final showdown had begun, and the fate of the mystic lands hung in the balance. The air crackled with raw energy as Kael stood face to face with his uncle, the weight of their shared history pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. This wasn't just a battle of spells, it was a duel of wits, willpower, and the very essence of what it meant to wield magic. Kael, though weakened from the trials of his journey, felt a fire burning within him. Every lesson, every failure, every moment of doubt had led him here. His uncle, a master of deception and manipulation, seemed almost invincible, his magic swirling around him like a tempest. But Kael had something his uncle had long since lost: resolve. Spells collided in bursts of light and shadow, each strike a testament to the years of training and sacrifice on both sides. Kael's uncle taunted him, trying to break his spirit, but Kael held firm. He remembered the wisdom of the ancient tomes, the guidance of mentors long gone, and the quiet strength of Lyra, who stood nearby, her eyes sharp and focused. She wasn't just a spectator, she was a key player in this fight. With precision and cunning, Lyra began to disrupt her uncle's spells, her magic weaving through the chaos like a thread unraveling a tapestry. Her efforts created openings, moments where Kael could strike, and he seized every one. The tide turned slowly but decisively. Kael's uncle, for all his power, had underestimated the bond between Kael and Lyra, the unspoken trust that allowed them to fight as one. With a final, desperate move, Kael channeled all his remaining energy into a single spell, one that mirrored the lessons of balance and sacrifice he'd learned along the way. The blast was deafening, a blinding flash that left the chamber trembling. When the light faded, his uncle lay defeated, his magic spent, but victory came at a price. The relic, the very object they had fought to protect, shattered under the strain of the battle. As its fragments scattered, the portal to the mystic lands began to collapse, its shimmering surface flickering like a dying flame. Kael and Lyra exchanged a glance, their triumph tinged with sorrow. The mystic lands, a realm of wonder and mystery, were slipping away, and with them, a part of their journey. Yet, as the portal faded, Kael realized something profound. The true magic wasn't in the destination. It was in the path they had walked together, the bonds they had forged, and the strength they had discovered within themselves. As the ground beneath their feet cracked and crumbled, Kael and Lyra sprinted through the chaos of the mystic lands, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding in unison. The once majestic realm was now a crumbling nightmare, the sky fractured like shattered glass, and the air thick with the scent of decay. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the land itself was trying to drag them down into its collapsing depths. Kael's mind raced faster than his feet, not just to escape, but to make sense of everything that had led him to this moment. The choices he'd made, the allies he'd gained and lost, the sacrifices that had brought him here, all of it weighed on him as heavily as the collapsing world around him. Lyra, ever the pragmatist, shouted over the deafening roar of falling stone and twisting magic, urging him to focus. This isn't the time for regrets, Kael. Move, her voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and urgent, pulling him back to the present. Together, they dodged falling debris and leapt over widening chasms, their bond forged in fire and desperation. The portal ahead shimmered faintly, its light flickering as if fighting to stay open. It was their only hope, but it was fading fast. With every ounce of strength left in them, they lunged toward the portal, the ground giving way beneath their feet. Just as the gateway began to close, they tumbled through, the force of their momentum sending them sprawling onto the cool, solid earth of the Forgotten Realms. Behind them, the portal snapped shut with a final, thunderous crack, sealing the ancient evil within the mystic lands once more. For a moment, there was silence, a rare, fragile stillness that felt almost sacred after the chaos they'd endured. Kael lay on his back, staring up at the clear, unbroken sky, his chest heaving. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the weight of what they just survived. He turned to Lyra, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, and managed a weak smile. "We made it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra, still catching her breath, nodded. "Barely," she replied with a half-hearted laugh, though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion and emotion she rarely let surface. In that quiet moment, the magnitude of their journey settled over them. They had faced unimaginable dangers, uncovered ancient secrets, and confronted the darkest parts of themselves. And now, here they were, alive, but forever changed. Kael sat up, his gaze distant as he reflected on the path that had brought him here. He thought of the power he'd gained, the knowledge he now carried, and the responsibility that came with it. "I can't let this be for nothing," he murmured, more to himself than to Lyra. "I have to use what I've learned to make a difference, to protect the realms, not exploit them." His voice was firm, resolute, as if the trials he'd endured had finally clarified his purpose. Lyra, meanwhile, sat quietly, her thoughts turning inward. For years, she'd lived by her wits, surviving as a thief in a world that had shown her little kindness. But now, for the first time, she felt the stirrings of something new, a desire to break free from the shadows of her past. "Maybe it's time for me to stop running," she admitted, her voice softer than usual, "to find something more." The air between them was thick with unspoken understanding. They had started this journey as strangers, bound by circumstance, but now they were something far greater: partners, allies, and perhaps even friends. As they sat there, beneath the vast, open sky of the Forgotten Realms, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet triumph. The road ahead was uncertain, but for now, they had survived. And that, in itself, was a victory worth savoring. As the sun dipped low over the jagged peaks of the Mystic Lands, Kael and Lyra stood at the crossroads, their paths diverging for the first time since fate had brought them together. The weight of their shared journey hung in the air, a tapestry of trials and triumphs that had bound them as allies and friends. Kael's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, its blade now etched with the runes of his ancestors, a symbol of the legacy he had fought so hard to reclaim. Lyra, her staff glowing faintly with the remnants of arcane energy, turned to him with a smile that was both wistful and resolute. Kael's footsteps carried him back to the ruins of his ancestral home, a place once steeped in pride and power, now reduced to crumbling stone and memories. But where others saw only loss, Kael saw possibility. With every step, he felt the pull of his lineage, a call to rebuild not just walls and towers, but the spirit of his family's name. The lessons of the mystic lands had taught him that true strength lay not in dominance, but in balance, a harmony between past and future, power and responsibility. Meanwhile, Lyra's path led her westward, toward horizons she had only dreamed of before. The weight of her past, once a chain around her heart, had been replaced by a quiet hope. The world stretched before her, vast and unknown, but she no longer feared its uncertainties. Her journey had shown her that even the darkest shadows could be pierced by light, and that the arcane forces she once feared could be wielded with wisdom and care. As the forgotten realms settled into a fragile peace, the mystic land stood as a silent sentinel, a reminder of the delicate equilibrium between creation and destruction. The arcane energies that had threatened to consume the world now lay dormant, but their presence lingered, a whisper in the wind. Kael, standing at the edge of his ancestral lands, gazed toward the distant peaks. He knew this was not an end, but a beginning. The mysteries of the arcane still beckoned, and the world held secrets yet to be uncovered. And so, the story of Kael and Lira became a testament to the enduring power of choice and the resilience of the human spirit. Their journeys, though separate, were bound by the threads of shared purpose and the lessons of the mystic lands. As the stars began to dot the evening sky, one thing was certain: the arcane would always call, and those who listened would find their destinies intertwined with the very fabric of the world itself.